Every great album has that one record, not necessarily the biggest hit, not the fan favorite, not even the song people play the most. It's the song that unlocks everything else. And that's exactly what this series is about. Today, we're talking about one of the greatest debut albums ever created, Reasonable Doubt. 30 years ago, Shawn Corey Carter wasn't Jay-Z. He wasn't a billionaire. He wasn't married to Beyonce or the father of Blue Ivy roomie and Sir Carter. There was no Rock Nation, no billion-dollar business portfolio, no Yankee Stadium performances, just another rapper from Brooklyn that the majority of labels didn't believe in. And instead of waiting for permission, he bet on himself. Alongside Damon Dash and Kareem Biggs Burke, he co-founded Roc-a-fella Records and independently released an album that over the next 3 decades will become one of hip-hop's most celebrated classics. Today, as Jay-Z prepares to celebrate Reasonable Doubt's 30th anniversary with concerts in New York, Los Angeles, and Paris, it's hard to imagine that this album almost never happened. But here's what's always fascinated me about Reasonable Doubt. Most people remember it's a hustler's album, an album about money, luxury, Rolexes, crystal, drug dealing, designer suits, power. But I don't think that's what this album is actually about. I think Reasonable Doubt is an album about the psychological cost of chasing success. And hidden somewhere inside of these 14 tracks is the one song that unlocks everything Jay-Z was trying to tell us. And to understand why this album still matters, you have to understand where Jay-Z was in 1996. Hip hop was exploding. The East Coast had reclaimed momentum. New York rap was filled with larger than life personalities, and labels were looking for the next superstar. But Shawn Corey Carter wasn't an easy sell. He was older than many new artists being introduced. His music wasn't radio friendly. He wasn't making dance records. He wasn't chasing trends. He sounded like someone who had already lived an entire lifetime before stepping into a recording booth. When labels passed, he and his partners created Roc-a-fella Records themselves. That decision would eventually reshape hip hop business forever. But before Jay-Z became one of music's greatest executives, he first had to convince people he belonged as an artist. And the funny thing is, Reasonable Doubt doesn't sound like someone trying to prove himself. It sounds like someone who's already convinced he belongs. From the opening moments of Can't Knock the Hustle, Jay doesn't introduce himself with insecurity. He introduces himself with certainty. He's talking about expensive cars, shopping sprees, bail money, designer clothes. He's already painting himself like a king. Then politics as usual arrives. More luxury, more confidence, more stories about navigating the streets like business meetings. Then comes Dead Presidents. For many people, this is the defining song of the album, and for good reason. It's one of the greatest rap songs ever written. Its central philosophy becomes immediately clear. Money isn't simply currency. Money represents freedom, escape, survival. Then feeling it slows everything down. Suddenly, Jay sounds almost relaxed, confident, comfortable, like he's finally enjoying everything he's worked for. Even Brooklyn's finest feels like a victory lap alongside the notorious B.I.G. Everywhere you look, the album seems to celebrate success, but if you listen closely, there's something else happening. Almost every song contains anxiety. Jay is constantly watching people watching him. He's looking over his shoulder, talking about betrayal, enemies, violence, talking about never truly relaxing. Even at his highest moment, he sounds exhausted. And that's when it hit me. Maybe this isn't an album celebrating the hustle. Maybe it's just documenting an addiction. Every record raises the stakes. Every song pushes him deeper. Every success creates another problem. Every dollar creates another enemy. Until eventually we arrive at the song I believe is the most important song on the entire album. It's not Dead Presidents. It's not Can't Knock the Hustles. It's not Can I Live. The most important song on Reasonable Doubt is The Evils. And I don't think that's accidental because the title itself tells you everything. Not devils, but the evils. The evil isn't some supernatural force. The evil is greed, it's power, it's paranoia, it's betrayal and jealousy. The evil is watching money slowly become more important than the people you love. And that's what makes this song brilliant. Throughout Reasonable Doubt, Jay-Z has been selling us the dream, the cars, the women, the jewelry, the expensive champagne, the reputation, the money. But with one song, he pulls the curtain back. Suddenly, the dream doesn't look glamorous anymore. It looks lonely, it looks exhausting, and it looks dangerous. It's almost as if Shawn Carter interrupts the Jay-Z character and says, "Let me tell you what this life actually does to a person." For the first time on the album, Jay stops romanticizing the lifestyle. He starts exposing it. Early in the song, he admits something incredibly revealing. He says there was a time he never prayed to God. He prayed to John Gotti, though. Think about that. That's more than a clever lyric. It's a confession. His faith wasn't in morality. His faith was in survival. His religion became power. His belief system became whatever kept him alive. That's an incredibly honest admission because he's not bragging about it. He's just explaining how survival can completely reshape your moral compass. You stop asking what's right. You start asking what works. And that's a dangerous place to live. That's the very definition of corruption. Then comes the second verse, and in my opinion, it's one of the greatest verses Jay-Z has ever written. He tells the story of friendships destroyed by money. People who once grew up together now plotting against each other. The closer they get to success, the further apart they become. And decades later, that sounds a little familiar on one person's part, doesn't it? But that progression matters because it's exactly what's been happening throughout the entire album. Money hasn't solved anyone's problem, it's multiplied them. Think about that. Every song before this had made wealth feel like the destination, but The Evils reveals that wealth wasn't the finish line. It was the beginning of a completely different nightmare. Friends become suspects, loyalty becomes transactional. Every conversation has an ulterior motive. Every relationship becomes a business deal. The higher Jay climbs, the fewer people he can trust. That's why this record feels so heavy. It isn't really about drug dealing, it's about isolation. Then comes the third verse, and this is where the entire album reaches its emotional climax. Earlier records made Jay sound like the master of his environment, but here he sounds possessed by it. He admits his soul became consumed by diamonds, luxury cars, alcohol, violence, status, power. He even says the devils are beating him down. Listen to the wording. He isn't saying he's using money anymore. He's saying money is using him. The streets promised him freedom, but somewhere along the way, he became trapped by the very thing he thought would save him. And once that realization hits, the entire album changes. Not just this song, but every song. It's almost like watching a movie for the second time after learning the ending. All the clues were there from the beginning. You just didn't know what you were listening to yet. Can't Knock the Hustle isn't simply confidence anymore, it's survival. Dead Presidents isn't just ambition, it's obsession. Politics as usual isn't swagger, it's routine trauma. Even Can I Live, which many people, including me, will argue is the album's thesis, becomes something different. That song asks whether there's another way. The Evils answers the question, no. At least not for the man Jay was documenting in 1996. That's why I don't believe The Evils is simply the best written song on the album. I believe it's the key. Every great film has the scene that suddenly makes everything click. Every great novel has the chapter where all the pieces come together. The Evils is the moment for a reasonable doubt. It's the song that changes the album from a collection of incredible rap records into one complete story. But Jay wasn't finished. He quietly gives us one final clue. The album doesn't end with celebration, it ends with regrets. That title alone is important. The album begins with hustle, it ends with regret. That's not a coincidence, y'all. Throughout regrets, Jay reflects on the emotional consequence of the life he's been describing the entire album. He talks about stress, his mother's pain, friends he's lost, the constant fear of violence, and ultimately accepts that surviving this life means carrying emotional scars forever. Listen to the progression. We begin with confidence, then ambition, then wealth, then paranoia, then corruption, then regret. That's not random sequencing, that's storytelling. Whether Jay intended people to analyze it this way or not, 30 years later, it reads like one long cautionary tale. This was never just a victory story. It was a cautionary tale told by someone who hadn't escaped yet. And maybe that's why Reasonable Doubt has aged better than almost any rap debut. It doesn't glamorize the streets nearly as much as people remember. It documents it, the beauty, ambition, the intelligence, but also also the isolation, the paranoia, the guilt, and the compromises. What's fascinating is that Jay himself spent the next 30 years proving there was another way. He became the businessman, the executive, the owner, the billionaire, the husband, the father. In many ways, the Shawn Corey Carter we know today feels like someone who eventually escaped the man we met on Reasonable Doubt. And maybe that's another reason this album continues to resonate. We aren't just listening to the birth of Jay-Z. We're listening to the final chapters of Shawn Corey Carter's life before everything changed. 30 years later, that independent album is now going to be celebrated in Yankee Stadium. Think about how unbelievable that would have sounded back in 1996. The artists major labels refused to sign will now celebrate the very album they overlooked in one of the most iconic stadiums in America. That's full circle. And that's why I believe The Evils is the most important song on Reasonable Doubt. Not because it's the catchiest or it was the biggest record, but because it's the moment Shawn Corey Carter stops performing the role of the hustler and starts revealing the human being underneath it all. Without The Evils, Reasonable Doubt is one of the greatest mafioso rap albums ever created. With The Evils, it becomes something even greater, a psychological study, a tragedy, a confession. 30 years later, we're still dissecting this album because it wasn't simply documenting how to become successful. It was documenting what success demanded before the world ever knew the name Jay-Z. And perhaps that's the greatest irony of all. The biggest gamble Shawn Corey Carter ever made wasn't standing on a street corner. It was believing in himself when no one else would. 3 decades later, though, the man who couldn't get a record deal is celebrating his debut album in stadiums around the world. Sometimes betting on yourself really is the most important move you'll ever make.